And welcome to the third day of the EPIIC Symposium on Migration in a Turbulent World. My name is Zach Goldberg, and I'm a sophomore in this year's EPIIC class majoring in economics. Thank you for joining us this morning to discuss cities, migration's frontline. Cities today account for more than 1/2 of the world's population, and they are often the focal point of economic and social prosperity. Urbanization has frequently been a driver of migration as cities create new jobs and opportunities that draw people to move there. Migrants overwhelmingly settle in cities where they significantly drive growth. Migrants are also a source of new ideas and innovation and play a role in enriching the destination city. But there are also challenges, and cities, whether in the global south or the global north, are on the front lines of contending with a range of issues from affordable housing to integrating new arrivals. Can and should the perception of migration transform from a drain on resources to an opportunity for growth? Cities have little influence in national migration policy development, and despite the fact that they are increasingly the places where migrants are located. This panel aims to discuss the role that cities and their leaders have to play in migration and how cities can invest in migration as a long-term phenomenon by adapting and transforming for a dynamic future. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to briefly explain how our panel will run. Each panelist has been asked to speak for up to 12 minutes, essentially an oral op-ed, and then we will open up to questions from the audience. And now, I would like to introduce our first panelist, Justin Steele. Mr. Steele is a professor of law and urban planning at MIT. His research examines the intersection of urban policy with property, land use, and civil rights. Mr. Steele?
Great. Thank you, Zach. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for having me. Thank you all for being here. I'll start with a juxtaposition that's motivated some of my research. So on July 13th, 2006, the City Council of Hazleton, Pennsylvania, enacted a law explicitly designed to drive undocumented immigrants in particular, but immigrants more broadly, from its jurisdiction by prohibiting the rental of any housing unit to anyone who didn't have documented immigration status, and also by making English the official language of the city and prohibiting any official communications in any other language than English. This law was enacted after 2 decades in which the city's population went from being 2% Latino to 40% Latino. The very same week, however, just down the Lehigh Valley in eastern Pennsylvania, the city council of an economically similar city experiencing a very similar demographic shift created a human relations commission designed to convey the message in their words that Easton is a town where diversity is spoken. And so that made me ask, what can explain their diverging responses? And this is a question that's motivated about a decade of qualitative and quantitative research, trying to answer what explains why outwardly similar local governments respond differently to rapid demographic shifts. And I think that this can touch on some of the questions that Zach asked about the role of cities at the front line of immigration, issues of affordable housing, of whether I think empirically we can see that immigrants contribute a tremendous amount to the economic growth of cities, but often they're perceived as taking away from neighborhood quality of life or economic growth or adding costs. And so I think that these examples can shed a little bit of light on that. So I'll speak very briefly about some of my findings. So one of the surprising things that I found was that local laws seeking to exclude undocumented immigrants don't actually seem to be associated with job competition or unemployment, which is often what we hear is motivating resistance to immigration. But it does seem actually more related to measures of housing and housing prices and neighborhood change, which in the United States is usually people's, for those who are homeowners, it's usually the most valuable asset that they own. And also among similar cities, I found that one of the things that differentiates those cities that responded in exclusionary and inclusionary ways is the capacity to manage the conflicts that sometimes arise, especially over property, but over public space and other issues in a context of economic and social and demographic change. And so the qualitative interviews and the social network analysis that I did of relationships among civil society networks in these cities suggested that the capacity to respond to difference and to conflict over property in these contexts is shaped crucially by the architecture of local social networks. And so as Zach was saying, we generally see cities as playing a secondary role, because immigration, especially in the United States, but in almost all other countries, is determined primarily by the national government. In the United States, since the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 and the Supreme Court's articulation of the doctrine of plenary power over immigration in Che-Chan-Ping versus the United States in 1889, we've generally seen the regulation of immigration as an exclusively federal responsibility. But of all levels of government, it's really local governments that interact most directly with immigrants, as with all residents. Municipal governments can play crucial roles in fostering immigrant integration into neighborhoods, into the workforce, into local social and political life. And basic issues such as land use, the permitting of businesses, the use of both private and public spaces, housing code enforcement, school management, and policing are often the most crucial locations for either conflict or cohesion between the recently arrived and the native born. And so of all levels of government, it's really local governments that stand to benefit most directly from immigration and also to bear any costs that immigration may bring. And so what we've seen in the past decade in the United States is that cities have increasingly challenged federal plenary power over immigration and have taken action into their own hands. But cities have acted, as I started out explaining, in diverging ways, with some cities trying to exclude immigrants, like the Hazleton example that I started with. For instance, passing laws prohibiting municipal publications in any language other than English, or laws targeting day laborers by prohibiting the solicitation of work on public roads. And other cities, like the Easton example I started with, have sought to welcome and include immigrants, passing laws limiting city officials from asking about immigration status, laws creating municipal identification cards to make it easier for immigrants to access city resources, laws permitting non-citizen voting in local elections, or laws limiting cooperation with immigration and customs enforcement with regard to immigration detainers. And this has obviously been in the news a lot since the Trump election. It started before, but there's been a huge groundswell of that recently. And so I was very interested in what are the local social structures and social processes that are actually at work on the ground that can explain why some of these similar local governments respond differently. And so it's partially partisanship. We're living in a particularly partisan moment, but it's more than just partisanship. And jobs matter, but as I said at the outset, there's a lot of other factors that I think actually matter more than jobs, even though jobs often get a lot of the attention. And so I'll share a couple of examples about the structure of local social networks among civil society organizations in one of the cities that I spent time studying. And broadly, the finding from the social network analysis that I did is that cities where the networks among civil society organizations are characterized more by clustering and fragmentation are associated with more exclusionary local policies, and those that are have a broader participation in civil society and where civil society organizations bridge some of the structural holes between different communities in a city are associated with more inclusive policies. So there are two elements of this that I think I can describe briefly that are particularly useful. So one is bridging organizations. And so I spent a lot of time studying a city called Grand Island in Nebraska, which is an overwhelmingly Republican city and an overwhelmingly Republican state. Given the current tenor of partisanship around immigration issues, you wouldn't necessarily think of this as a welcoming city, but it is a particularly welcoming city. And so one crucial aspect of that was an organization called the Multicultural Coalition that the mayor sponsored and the city helped create in the early 2000s as they saw the demographics of the city changing and said, there's an opportunity to do something here. This could be great for Grand Island. We want to embrace this, and we want to try and make sure that our whole population sees the changes in Grand Island as having benefits for all of us. And so there's a particular program that the Multicultural Coalition created, which was really powerful, called the Grassroots Leadership Development Program. And it identified emerging leaders in recent immigrant communities and brought them together to build their capacities to participate in local civic and political life by convening them each week with a different public official from city or county government to understand that particular official's domain, whether it's the Parks Department director or the police chief or the mayor or a county judge, to say, look, this is how city and county government work here, and this is how you can have a voice and an impact. And so that strongly benefited the immigrant participants by giving them a sense of how they can have an impact and really giving them a sense of ownership over the city, where one example is that a recent arrival said, you know, we've been playing soccer on the baseball fields. That can sometimes lead to conflict. There's this empty land that I think the city owns. We could turn it into soccer fields. Let's do that. And he knew the Parks Commissioner from this process and said, can we do this? The Parks Commissioner, that's a great idea. And so here, immigrants have a channel to change the city physically to meet their needs. But it also provided a unique opportunity for public officials to meet immigrant leaders, which is especially important when conflicts arise, to say, who can we talk to, who can we get a sense of what their experiences are and what their perspectives are. And the other aspect that I'll mention quickly is bridging coalitions, that there were a lot of formal networks of organizations connecting independent nonprofits and city agencies, which provided a larger scale arena in which formerly isolated individuals and organizations could collaborate on shared citywide initiatives. And this ability to work together on shared boards or coalitions created a context in which residents from formerly isolated groups worked together repeatedly as equals on shared overarching goals that required collaboration. And what that did was create an opportunity for new inclusive identities to be formed. It created a context in which the group boundaries that people often fell back upon, language, race, ethnicity, started to become blurred, and a shared local identity was reinforced. The idea that recent arrivals had the potential to contribute to civic leadership, that the city was benefiting from their presence, and that its resources, the city's resources, can and would expand with its population. And so one example of this in Grand Island was work around creating a new high school. And so bringing everyone together to work on that made a sense, oh, we're all in this together, we all have something to contribute. And so one quick example I can share of that was there was also an effort to encourage naturalization and citizenship. And so through the Multicultural Coalition board, a police officer and someone who taught citizenship classes at the community college met. And she said, you know, could you help me when I have students who seem afraid of the process, who I'm worried are going to choke up or choke in the interview? Could you do a practice interview with them? And he said, yeah, of course. So she calls him, he puts on his uniform and comes down and does practice interviews with people for their citizenship classes, just to give them some more comfort for when they're actually in the room with citizenship and immigration services. And so this diffused a whole set of inclusionary norms through these types of collaborations. And so these are some examples from the US, which is the context that I know best. But these questions of immigrant inclusion and exclusion at the city level are really international as well. And so as ever larger numbers of people live outside the country of their birth and the world is increasingly urbanized, cities are being reshaped by immigrants. And the increasing share of foreign-born residents presents opportunities for local governments and also challenges of social and political incorporation. We've seen in the past decade urban uprisings in London, Paris, Stockholm, Singapore, and elsewhere that have brought media attention to the challenges of immigrant integration. And we've also seen anti-immigrant riots in Moscow and Johannesburg, Calais, Tel Aviv, Rome, and other cities that are expressing resistance by some urban residents to the arrival of the foreign-born. And so I think we have to focus on both sides of this. And the increasing heterogeneity of cities has the potential to exacerbate urban fragmentation, to entrench categorical inequalities. But cities have long been comparatively more diverse and inclusive than their respective nation states, spaces where marginalized groups have created spaces of refuge and of empowerment. And so I think the question to leave with you, and the question for this panel, is how can urban policymakers ensure that even in times of economic uncertainty and rapid demographic change, cities can become both more inclusive and more just for all, more equal, and more united? Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Steele, for contrasting the very different approaches that cities can have towards migration and for those thought-provoking questions. Our next panelist, Samir Saliba. Mr. Saliba is an urban technical advisor for the International Rescue Committee. he has just released a report, Urban Refugee, How Cities Are Building Inclusive Communities, which will be the focus of his talk. Thank you, Mr. Saliba.
Great. Good morning, everyone. How are we all doing? You all know that it's a Saturday morning, right? I'm not quite sure why you're here. I would not be here to see me speak, but I hope that this catches your attention. I could actually ask for a better presentation before this one, Justin, so thanks for that, because I'm going to focus on what cities are doing internationally, specifically for displaced populations, refugees, and internally displaced people. But before I do so, who knows about the International Rescue Committee? Can I just see a show of hands? Okay, so quite a number of you, but for those of you that don't know, the IRC was founded by Albert Einstein around the world wars, specifically to provide refuge to those whose lives have been affected by conflict. We now work in over 40 countries around the world and also do resettlement here for refugees in the US. Part of the reason why I have a job is because the majority of refugees and IDPs actually do not live in dusty camps in the middle of nowhere with a big UNHCR logo on top of it. They live in towns and cities around the world. And my job is to really look at how the humanitarian infrastructure is set up and how it needs to be adapted to meet the needs of refugees and IDPs living in cities. And part of that means not only looking at the needs of refugees and IDPs living in cities, but also the general needs of these cities and their marginalized populations within them. So that's just a bit of a background. My work before this started here. Does anybody know where this is? Any guesses? Very close. This is Breezy Point in New York City after Hurricane Sandy. So my job as an urban planner in New York after Hurricane Sandy was all about this term resilience and building back better. After Hurricane Sandy happened, there was about 2 weeks of recovery efforts, and then the question quickly turned to how can we leverage New York's resources and all the expertise that is in New York to make sure that an event like this never happens again. Contrast that with a place like this. Who knows where this is? Any guesses? Haiti. This is you're on this is great. This is Port-au-Prince after the earthquake in 2010. A response that was largely humanitarian in nature. A lot of the typical actors that were there, including my own organization, responded to this. But they did so not with the same perspective as New York, which was get it back on its feet and then think about how we can prevent it in the future. It was emergency response. Up until then, I would argue, still is emergency response 9 years later. And so there's a difference in perspective between how we approach emergencies in the West and how we approach emergencies in the so-called East and the more developing countries. And that, when I first joined the international rescue community and joined the international community generally, that was the biggest contrast in my mind that I just couldn't understand. Why are we approaching cities like New York any differently than why are we approaching cities like Port-au-Prince any differently than we should cities like New York? Why is that difference in perspective? And it shouldn't just be because of resource levels and income levels and how wealthy these cities are. But I do think there's an inherent problem with how we approach cities like that. And part of the reason why that's a problem and why setting up camps in general is a problem is because of this person's opinion about camps. This is a gentleman in northeast Nigeria, in Maiduguri, who has forced to flee because of Boko Haram activity in northeast Nigeria. And is now residing in Maiduguri, a city that has doubled in population because of the Boko Haram crisis. So just to think about that, this is a city in northeast Nigeria that is tremendously marginalized, and even within its own country, if you compare it to Abuja or Lagos. But it has doubled in size and population, and the traditional response has been camps. But as this gentleman notes, life in camps is not that great. And people are largely voting with their feet. So, as Zach mentioned, I wanted to dive in a little bit into this. The European refugee crisis, for example, has really highlighted what cities like Athens, Paris, Bristol are doing to support their refugees incoming into their cities. But what this report, Urban Refuge, tried to do is really paint a global picture of what the city response actually looks like for displaced populations. And you can see just by looking at this map, those circles that are bigger are cities that are hosting more, and you can see how the map sort of shifts between the East and the West, right? So when the European quote-unquote crisis happened, you started to hear a lot about what Athens was doing, what Paris was doing, what London was doing, etc. But what you didn't hear about was what Kampala has been doing for the past 10 years. What Beirut has been doing, more or less, they weren't included in this, for the past 40 years, what Amman has been doing for the past 60 years with their Palestinian refugees. And if you look at the numbers, these 23 cities that were included in this report host over 5 million displaced residents. That's about 7% of the world's total population, and about over 200,000 per city. This displacement, this urban displacement, is happening in cities that are rapidly growing in general due to urbanization. So 11 are in countries with projected urban population growths of 2% or higher over the next 10 years. And these cities host that, so if you look at the average number of displaced residents in cities that are rapidly urbanizing, that number, the average number of the cities we interviewed doubles to over 400,000 refugees in these cities. 6 are projected to be mega cities, 13 have a dedicated budget, office or long-term plan to support displaced populations, 19 have prioritized partnerships with the international community, but only 4 have established coordination forums within their city. But really, what I want you to walk away with is just this. If there's one simple thesis of this report, it's this. Is that the cities hosting the most are doing so with the least. And why is that? And why is it that cities like Kampala, who have traditionally been neglected by the international community, and are rapidly urbanizing at a rate that you can just see the growth since 1998, are not receiving the same attention as some of these other cities in the West, in the US or in Europe. So this is Kampala, Uganda. I saw you guys wondering where that was, my fault. This is a city that has grown a lot since 1998, but by 2030 it's projected to be more populous than the city of Tokyo, which, for those of you that don't know, is the biggest city in the world. Compare and contrast. So again, what I wanted to do with this report was really put these cities on an equal playing field. And so you might not think that there are similarities between Los Angeles and Kampala, but they are. Both are tremendously willing, a little bit like what Justin was talking about, tremendously willing to buck the trend of their national policies and do their best to create a welcoming environment for the refugees and migrants living within their city. Los Angeles hosts about, they don't have exact numbers, but they host about 500 refugees. Kampala hosts 100,000 refugees. Los Angeles has put tens of millions of dollars to immigrant programs, such as providing legal trainings in libraries so that any immigrant, regardless of immigration status, can walk into a library and receive information about how to navigate the asylum process or receiving citizenship within the US. And that's a service that's free of charge to all immigrants residing within the city, regardless of their background. Versus Kampala, which is just starting to get their refugee and immigrant program started, and has repeatedly received rebukes from international donors to start their own programs, right? But they're hosting more at the same time. And so this is really the thing that my research highlights as something that desperately needs to change. So what makes a city inclusive? And I think this is one of the things that's a bit tricky about my role at the IRC is because we are mandated to support refugees. We are mandated to support those whose lives have been affected by crisis. So if we come into a city and refugees, as they often do, are living in low-income informal neighborhoods of a city, how can we in good conscience go into that neighborhood and say, sorry everybody else, we're just here to help 10 to 5% of this population? So what we need to do personally, as the international rescue community, is rethink how we deliver services in a city like Kampala. And what we need to do is not divorce ourselves from our mandate, but think about how our mandate can tie into a wider response to the needs of a city. And that sort of led me to this diagram here, which on the left-hand side, you have the level of engagement between the city, the private sector, and the humanitarian community. And on the right-hand side, you have examples of services. So the argument that I make here is that when you think about all services for all residents, that really should be a city service. That should be the local authorities that are delivering it. That's not to say that humanitarians don't have a role to play. We do, but that role should be in supporting local governments. If you're thinking about specifically services for marginalized residents, we argue that there should be equal representation and equal service provision from cities, from humanitarian service providers, and from the private sector for things such as social services, for things such as safe spaces for women and children, or employment training and financial inclusion. And then lastly, this goes to what I started with, there should be specific services for displaced residents. I don't want to make the argument that the best way to treat refugees in cities is to treat them as any resident. In general, yes, not for 90%, yes, but for specific things like migration status or trauma-informed care. The international community, specifically humanitarian organizations, do have a specific mandate to meet those populations, and we can fit within that role for that specific population. What does that look like in normal terms? I think it looks like this. Who can tell me the difference between these pictures? This is the fantastic New York City subway from about 30 years ago and today. You don't have individualized seats, exactly. So what the before picture is saying is that your ass must be this big to ride the subway. And it's normalizing that characteristic. And in that way, excluding people whose asses are this big. Forgive my French, it's a Saturday. This is a Saturday presentation. And what the city rightly, and the designers of the subway rightly realized, is if we actually remove these barriers, then we can create more access for more people. And that's the difference between a rights-based approach and what we call a practical access approach, right? So you have, on this subway car, you do have specific seats for people living with disabilities, things like that, but in general, we reduce barriers to access for this particular service in a very creative way. And that's what cities around the world are doing and what I advocate for directly to city governments. It's not so much, if I go back to the slide, yes, you should think about specific services for displaced residents, but you should also think about how to offer your public services to refugee populations. Because cities have an opportunity to do so. Going back to Justin, your presentation a little bit, who's a delegation from France here? So, la différence entre citadin et citoyen, c'est quoi? En anglais, please. Citadin and citoyen. Yeah.
Citoyen would be someone participating in the life of the city, like implementing.
Or the citizen of the state versus the citizen of the city. And that's sort of how I view the opportunity of cities, right? As Justin mentioned, the legalities of legal status mostly rests with the state. But at a city, there's an opportunity to treat refugees as a constituent of that city, and that opens up a whole world of opportunities. I might skip through these slides. Just to quickly end, that to best support cities in creating inclusive communities, the international community must approach all cities as partners whose voices matter and whose efforts we should strengthen through investment, technical support, and collaboration. A lot of words, kind of hard to understand. If you walk away with one thing, it's really just this in your careers as you move forward. Just say hello. So this is a bit of methodology for the research for urban refuge, where I was working with our Iraqi office to get the contact information for the mayor of Mosul. For those of you that don't know, Mosul was recently, quote unquote, liberated from ISIS. Half the population was displaced for a period of time, and now there's a lot of questions about how the city can build back. All these people taking pictures of this slide is making me nervous. But I reached out to the office and said, can you put me in touch with their field coordinator in Mosul so that I can get the contact of the information from the mayor and move from there? The person said, sure, Ghassan is your main point of contact. Here's his number. So I WhatsApped this number saying, hi, Ghassan, this is Samer, IRC Urban Advisor in New York. Maria gave me your number. And then I looked at the picture. It was this dude sitting in what looked like a throne with a tie and a full suit on. And I did some Google researching. And I was like, oh, damn, this is the mayor. And I said, apologies, Mayor Al-Araji. I thought this was Ghassan's number, but I'm glad to connect with you. And his response was simply, welcome, I am happy to communicate with you. And we just carried on a WhatsApp conversation from there. This is the assumption that the majority of the international community makes, is that we cannot have these conversations with people such as the mayor of Mosul. It largely falls within development actors, UN, World Bank, to really liaise with these. But all actors, given the challenges that cities face and the complexity that they face moving forward, should be able to have conversations like this. And it really just starts with forgetting what your mandate is, forgetting what your specific solution is and how you're going to enact it, but simply starting a conversation by saying hello. I'll end there. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Saliba, for that wonderful presentation and comparing how different cities can leverage their resources to best cope with crises. Our final panelist is Dr. Atiya Martin. Dr. Martin is the Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Boston, the former Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Boston as part of the 100 Resilient Cities. She has also been adjunct faculty at Northeastern University in the Master of Homeland Security program. And now, let us all please welcome Dr. Atiya Martin.
I don't have any slides, but I'm going to come to the podium because I'm short and that microphone was all in my face, blocking my view of all of these wonderful faces. So good morning, everyone. I am so happy to be here with you. Life is real, and the drama to get here to see you today was also real. And so I am very excited because I rarely get to talk about migration issues within the urban context. And so to give you context on who the heck I am up here talking to you, just very briefly. So I was the former Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Boston, the first Chief Resilience Officer, and we released the first resilience strategy that focused on racial equity and social justice as our core resilience challenge that we embedded throughout all of the ways we think about resilience, whether we're talking about social, environmental, economic, or physical resilience. So with that said, my focus for today is actually kind of a nice succession of conversation, which is I want to talk about what are some of the ideologies that allow us to have such stark differences in who has and who does not have, whose humanity and dignity is respected and whose humanity and dignity is not respected. And so I'll start with one of the interesting things. Oh, I forgot to mention what I'm doing now. That's probably important, right? I'm not unemployed. So I'm actually the CEO and founder of a consulting firm called All Aces Inc. We focus on helping organizations to build equity and resilience into their organizations. And so I'll leave it at that. You can go to the website if you want to know more, allacesinc.com. And so the other role that I play right now is as a Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Global Resilience Institute at Northeastern University. So this idea of the role of the urban environment in migration and the ideologies that allow us to see such stark differences in people's lives, I think is foundational to all that we've been talking about up to this point. So I'm interested in your opinion, and I apologize for putting you guys on the spot on a Saturday morning, but I'm in good company because you've already been put on the spot this morning. So in your opinions, what are some of the ideas that allow us to see such differences with the way immigrants and migrants are being treated across the country, across the world, rather? I know, that's a hard question for a Saturday morning, but you showed up.
I mean, part of it all is just different situations. That's, you know, for instance, Sandy had different infrastructure. And, you know, one difference is just the resources available to the city and the existing infrastructure available to the city.
So there's this infrastructure discussion about what, and this is an important resilience concept, right? That the current state of affairs of any area can help you predict what the impacts are going to be after a disaster, right? And so if we know that there's infrastructure challenges before, that there's going to be infrastructure challenges after. We know that if there's environmental issues, whatever those environmental issues are, those are going to be, they're going to play a role in the consequences after an emergency or a disaster. We could go down the list of resilience domains to see that play out. But what else? Way in the back, and then I'm going to come down here to the front.
I think about safety and resources and our perception of safety. You know, who is a criminal, who is a terrorist, who is often like extremely racialized. And then also in terms of resources, kind of this idea that it's a pie and everyone gets a piece of the pie and the pie doesn't get bigger. And that people get less if more people come in.
Thank you so much. See, this is why I do this. I don't have to say anything. I'm going to come down to the front here.
Perception of migrants, just whether it's an issue to fix or whether it's something to take advantage of, is really just causes a massive difference in the mindset that people address this issue. Because if it's an opportunity, then it's much more about taking advantage of it, while if it's an issue to solve, then it's got a different approach to the
Did everyone hear that in the back? So I'm going to paraphrase with one of my favorite quotes. Most people don't recognize opportunity because it comes disguised as hard work. So how you frame the issue of migration as an opportunity or as a problem to be solved, it impacts the ultimate solutions that we come up with on the other end. And then I saw your hand over here, my peripheral vision.
Identity and belonging, and this question of othering. I belong here, this is my country, and you're coming in, and so it kind of meshes in with the other two.
Yes, thank you for adding that very explicitly, right? That we other people, right? And there's this sense of fear that comes behind it, usually in this form of xenophobia, right? And so as we think about what it means to be professionals in this space, where you could potentially be faced with the challenge of having to plan for or respond to what this could potentially look like in your area of responsibility, then that means that there's some questions we have to ask ourselves, some hard questions we have to ask ourselves as individuals. Because I hate to break it to all of us, but the systems that we keep talking about are us. There is no system without people. Like, we create these systems, right? We create the policies, we create the programs, we create the culture and the environment around programs and in our cities and in our jurisdictions. Like, we do those things. And with that in mind, that means as individuals who are stepping from I'm an individual in my personal life to an individual in my professional life, recognizing that those aren't two different things. You're still the same person, and we still bring everything that we've been socialized to believe and think and understand about the world into the roles that we play. So if we're being honest about our own humanity, then that means there's some work that we have to do on ourselves as we walk into these spaces. Because the other thing I hate to break to you is that we are not rational creatures. Yeah, we figured that out a little while ago. So I know there used to be like rational, behavioral economics and all that stuff. Yeah, so we're not rational at all. We're not wired to be rational. We're not socialized to be rational. And so in order to be rational, it actually takes a lot of effort and a lot of work. We actually have to learn critical thinking skills. right? We have to learn a process to manage ourselves, and by doing so, also develop some muscles that help to manage other people around us, to help them see reality for what it is and not just based on our individual interest or our vested interest, but the collective interest. And one of the things I wanted to share with you is one of my favorite explanations of what critical thinking is. As soon as I let my mother know that I'm trying to use my phone right now as she tries to call me, I'll call you right back. There we go. That said, critical thinking is self-guided, self-disciplined thinking which attempts to reason at the highest level of quality in a fair-minded way. People who think critically consistently attempt to live rationally, reasonably, empathetically. They are keenly aware of the inherent flawed nature of human thinking when left unchecked. They thrive to diminish the power of their egocentric, so our self-centered, and sociocentric, our group-focused tendencies. They use the intellectual tools that critical thinking offers, concepts and principles that enable them to analyze, assess, and improve thinking. They work diligently to develop the intellectual virtues of integrity, humility, civility, empathy, sense of justice, and confidence in reason. They realize that no matter how skilled they are as thinkers, they can always improve their reasoning abilities, and they can always at times fall prey to mistakes in reasoning, human irrationality, prejudices, biases, uncritically accepted social taboos and rules, self-interest and vested interest. They strive to improve the world in whatever ways they can and contribute to a more rational, civilized society. At the same time, they recognize the complexity often inherent in doing so. They strive never to think simplistically about complicated issues and always consider the rights and needs of others. They recognize the complexities in developing as thinkers and commit themselves to lifelong practice towards self-improvement. They embody the Socratic principle: the unexamined life is not worth living, because they realize that many unexamined lives together result in an uncritical, unjust, dangerous world. And so when we think about systems of oppression, when we think about the ideologies that are the foundation of those systems, which are us, that we all have role and responsibility in being able to step up as our best selves in the moments that matter most, where we're making decisions that are going to impact other people. And that means that we're applying these lenses to the work that we're doing and asking ourselves questions about who's going to be burdened, who's going to benefit, what are the potential consequences, and what are the opportunities that can come out of this. I'll end with a few quotes that I'm a quotes person. If you haven't figured it out already, okay, so. If it's not your struggle, it's invisible to you, right? And that was a lesson that I had to learn, even as a person of color living in a society that is hard to navigate because it's not meant for me and my children. My husband and I have 5 children, 2 still at home, to navigate effortlessly. It takes a lot of work. And even with that, I have to understand I'm not an immigrant. It's not my experience, right? And I have to be respectful that that is somebody else's experience, that I can't co-opt, that I can't claim, but I can be supportive of. That means that if I'm doing anything having to do with immigrants or migrants, that I am actually bringing them to the table so that they can speak for their own experiences, because it's not mine to speak for. The second quote that's connected to that is, you have to believe it to see it. You have to believe it to see it. And so it's this idea that if we don't understand who we are and why we do the silly things that we do, then we're never going to be able to see the ways that we're contributing to problems in ways that we don't intend to. We don't mean to do it, but we do. All we have to do is just show up and not be intentional about thinking critically and not be intentional about including others in conversations. Just by virtue of doing that, we can unintentionally be perpetuating inequities. So thank you so much for allowing me to be here with you today. I'm so excited for the rest of the discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Martin, for examining the root causes of many of the problems that we face today and how we as individuals can address such issues. I would like to thank all of our panelists for their opening remarks, and we would now like to open up the floor to questions from the audience. There is a microphone on each side, and we ask that you line up behind it. Please introduce yourself before asking the question, and in the interest of taking as many questions as possible, please try to keep the questions brief. Thank you.
Hi, thank you all for being here on a Saturday morning. We really appreciate it. My name is Carlos. I'm part of this year's EPIIC class. I would say that I strongly agree with the primary thesis of everything that you've said, mainly that cities should be at the front line of migration issues. I would venture out as saying that most of the EPIIC class agrees with this as well. In fact, we host a high school simulation later on in the year, and whereas we usually give them countries to represent, this year we decided to give them cities because we wanted to switch it up and see what they do with that. But in our research for this kind of symposium, this conference that we're going to be hosting, a primary issue that kept on coming up, and I think I'm going to direct this towards Dr. Steele, although I think you're all qualified to speak about this, so feel free to jump in. A primary issue that came for us as we were researching how a high school student could represent a city is the conflict that comes when city policy disagrees with national policy. And Dr. Steele, you mentioned migration policy is largely made on a federal level. I think you're right in saying that. Therefore, I guess my question has three short parts. The first part is, what happens when a city's policy disagrees with federal policy? Second, in the long run, do you see that migration policy is going to shift more from a federal level to more of a, I guess, smaller scale city level? And third, how do we ensure that happens? Because I certainly agree with you that it should.
Sure. So I'll just say a few things. So in the United States context, immigration law is often divided into two categories, what's called immigration laws, which regulate who can enter the country and on what terms, which are still generally understood as pretty much exclusively a federal responsibility or within federal power. But there's also a set of laws which are called alienage laws, which affect many things about those who are not citizens. And so there's often been a lot more room for states and localities to exercise some authority over that. So common examples are in terms of are there citizenship requirements for certain kinds of licenses or things like that. So anyway, that distinction between immigration laws and alienage laws may be helpful. But I think the bigger picture is that there's so much I could say about this question. But I think the bigger picture is that we see a national immigration policy that to some extent rests on undocumented work. And so we see cities in many ways responding to that national level work by trying to create, as was said earlier, some concepts of city citizenship, city belonging. How can people participate in the political, economic, and social lives of cities, regardless of what the national government says about their rights? So I guess I'll try and keep it that short.
I mean, since Dr. Martin likes quotes, I don't think this is on.
There it is.
It is, okay. Since Dr. Martin likes quotes, I'll just say one of my favorite, which is nations talk, cities act. Thank you.
Hello. First of all, it's such a pleasure and honor to be here. I've learned a great lot from what you have all been saying, and I feel sometimes the correct description to say that is like scales falling out from your eyes when you see how cities with actually tolerant and inclusive policies actually manage to deal with the situation better, and how so many of these are actually sort of national myths or civic myth about the disadvantages of migration. However, I have somewhat complex question to ask. We've all known that from the statistics and everything that we see, there's quite a lot of empirical evidence that proves that migration is not what some of the nationalists or whatever rhetoric says. But then why is there still a very large amount of people who refuses to believe that? Why are there still a lot of people who supports building a wall on the Mexican border? So personally, I've been thinking about this question, and I feel like it might not be because that these people are voluntarily unwilling to accept the truth. It might not be that they're unwilling to understand something like 1 + 1 = 2, but instead it's because they have personal grievances. Now, if I would like to raise an example from my own country, is that in China, many times the children and their parents, especially elderly parents, are often separated. And these elder people sometimes spend thousands of dollars purchasing fake medicine, which they are told will be able to help them get better. And this is often disproved by common media channels and the government alike. And research was done into why they actually do this. And it exploits that there is a common phenomenon in which these fake drug sellers, they are extremely nice to these old people. They have made these societies of warm brothership and stuff like that, so that when these old people come, they feel like they're part of a community. They feel like they have a family again. And that's why they're so willing to trust these people so much more than whatever the government or like rational stuff tells them to do. So I want to ask, this is my question, is that do you think the failure for a lot of people, for instance, in the United States or Western Europe, to truly appreciate the truth about migration, is it really because this truth is not widespread, or is it not empirical enough, or do you think it is actually because that they feel economically disadvantaged, or they are feeling unhappy about the current situation? Thank you.
Well, you started with the ideology question, so.
So, test 1 2 1 2 1 2. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So, there's two pieces to this. One is the majority of us do a lot of things unconsciously and not realizing it. The second part is there are some of us who are in positions of power or who are seeking more power, who leverage the lack of rationality that we have as people and how we've been socialized to take advantage of us, right? That's a combination of social engineering, which is what's happening in the example that you gave, as well as building off of and playing off of people's fear. And so when we're faced with a conflict between what we long believed and what is expected for us to believe versus something that flies in the face of that, right? Now I have this cognitive dissonance if I'm in that first category of like people who like just have been going along with these ideas, right? So you have that layer of complication. Then you have the other layer of complication where there are people who benefit from policies and programs that are harmful to lots of different groups, including in this situation, migrant populations, right? And so if I benefit from it, then of course I'm gonna tap into that fear that the people I know, because I know how social engineering works, right? It's called strategic oppression. In the context of racism, it's called strategic racism, where I may not even believe some of the stuff that I'm spewing, but I know that how people have been socialized, so I'm gonna play off of that to get what I want done. And so when you have those layers of complexity playing off of one another, it's easy to see how rationality cannot be present in those moments. And I'll give you a concept that's called bounded rationality. And it's this idea that when we are presented with a situation we have to make a decision, we're limited by our ability to reason or be reasonable is limited by the complexity of the issue, the amount of time we have to decide on the issue, and our cognitive capacity, which includes cognitive biases, fear, and all the other stuff that gets in our way. And the output of that is we make convenient decisions instead of optimal decisions. So I'll leave it at that.
I would just say that, in my experience, reality has not fallen to fallen victim to the same experience as facts. So whereas facts might not matter, reality still does. And that's certainly true when you hear rhetoric, and you use the term rhetoric. It is just rhetoric around fear of immigrants, fear of refugees, right up until you meet them, right up until you're hosting them in your neighborhood. And that's when the reality kicks in, and you're like, actually, this is not as bad as I thought. And so that's the optimism that I hold on to personally.
Leave it at that.
Ditto.
Thank you very much. Hi, good morning. My name is Liam. I'm a freshman here at Tufts, and I have a question for all three of you. It's pretty broad, but how does the physical structure of a city, particularly its density, affect its approach to incoming migrants?
It plays a huge role. I'll give you. Let's go to Jordan, where the capital city Amman is hosting about 400,000 refugees, which is way more than the northern city of Mafraq. But Mafraq is a border town, is smaller in size, and like Maiduguri, the example that I mentioned, has doubled in population because of its proximity. And so there's something that, I don't know if this is the academic term that everybody's agreed upon, but there's something called absorption capacity that plays a critical role. And so you're seeing a big difference between these capital cities, these primate cities like an Amman, like a Kampala, and these border cities, these sort of ports of first call, like an Arua in Uganda or a Mafraq in Jordan. And so if you go back to the triangle that I showed, the width of each of those layers changes dramatically depending on the size of the city, its ability to deliver resources, and the mandate of the local authority that's there. So sticking to that example, in Amman, the municipality of Amman can make a lot of decisions for itself, versus a city like Mafraq has to report directly to the Ministry of Interior. So it's not just physical characteristics that define how a city can respond, but it's also political differences and political characteristics that you have to keep in mind. I could talk about that forever, but I'll stop there.
I could mostly reiterate, but just add a few things that I think, one thing we always want to be careful of is environmental determinism, that there's this particular shape that creates directly a particular outcome, because they're usually mediated by social and institutional and political factors. But I think, building on what was just said, I think larger cities, more dense cities often have greater levels of heterogeneity, however that may be defined in a particular context, which can create more openings for immigrant communities to carve out their own space and to find support. And also reiterating what was said before, I think there's often more capacity, more resources, and so that's really crucial in fostering immigrant integration. And I guess also building on one of the things that was said is thinking as much about the physical characteristics as about the institutional characteristics. And this was something that I was thinking about on the way here, that the way that local governments are structured within a country or within a state or within a region is important in terms of whether local governments see themselves as in competition with each other and their residents see themselves as in competition with each other, whether they're anxious about, as was said earlier, kind of seeing this as a zero-sum competition with limited pieces of the pie, or as the potential for the pie to grow and redistribution to happen at a larger scale. So I'd also keep in mind the institutional and structures that are involved.
My answer is yes. And I think an important layer in terms of the power of cities is the power of leadership in cities. And so the spectrum of response to how these play out depends on what's the tone and tenor from the leadership in the cities, to kind of piggyback off of what was just said. And then the last thing is to see seen another resilience principle is diversity, biodiversity, diversity in the economy, diversity in people, right? In that there's actually, from a business perspective and from an economic government perspective, there's actually a competitive advantage that can be tapped into when we can see it clearly and we're not distracted by things that are not factual and are not based on reality.
Thank you all very much.
Good morning, all. I'm Arjun. I'm a sophomore at Tufts. Mr. Saliba, thank you so much for your speech. My question was, when urban planners like yourself and city administrators that actively engage with migration policy and understand the attitudes towards immigrants, should they be considering the views of the people towards immigrants, or should they be imposing their brand of what they believe is the right thing to do?
Yes. In order to design the solution, you have to first fully understand the problem. That doesn't mean divorcing yourself from your expertise. It just means that your expertise is being used in the right way. And the best way to ensure that your expertise is being used in the right way is to consult the communities that you're purporting to help. Should I just stop there? I should probably just stop there. I mean, like, it's a core principle of planning. It is not yet a core principle of humanitarianism. There's something called client responsiveness that my organization works on. There's even this battle between using the term client versus beneficiary, because we should be viewing our clients as clients, not just simply beneficiaries of aid. And a lot of that means shifting from you just coming in with a solution, and actually asking the communities you support. So it's not. I wouldn't say it's just on migration. I would say it's all things that relate to improving communities and delivering solutions to them.
Thank you so much.
I'm just going to add one thing, and that's this idea of self-determination. When people are not allowed to participate in decisions about their own lives, it actually has documented, based on the research, mental and physical health impacts, right? And so you're turning people, I'm borrowing from Paulo Freire's language from Pedagogy of the Oppressed, you're turning people into objects, right? To take people's ability to make decisions away from them is turning them into objects. And so I'll just say that.
I really like how much that guy enjoyed that reference up there. He's like, yes.
Amazing. All you have to do is get past the first chapter. Just all the words you look up in the first chapter, he just reuses them in the rest.
He was like, yes, shout out to Pedagogy for, I don't even remember the rest of it.
Pedagogy of the oppressed.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Noi from Israel, and my question is to Dr. Martin. Personally, I agree with the things you said and share your point of view. I wonder, how can we educate other people around us to see their role in accepting the refugees and to judge themselves for it?
Thank you for that. The shortest answer obviously has more layers in this, but I'm going to focus on two things. I think one is not to expend energy on people who are hell-bent on not accepting things, right? Like, that's a waste of energy, right? You focus on the people who are like the most of us, who are kind of in the middle of the distribution curve, just living their lives and have just taken positions because that's just a position they have been told to take, and not literally told to take, but have been socialized to take. And so, and what I've learned is that when you give people the full scope of reality, right, and give them opportunities to engage in that reality in real ways. So the concrete example is what was said earlier, which is this idea of, actually engaging with real people. It changes your perspective completely, right? Because now you've allowed some space to be surprised instead of what you expected from someone. When you kind of put that stuff to the side, you actually engage with people on a human level, you realize that we have a lot more in common than is so radically different, and that the things that are most important to us in our lives are the same. And so there's actually an international survey that happens every so often. I forget if they do it every 2 years or every 3 years. This international survey, they just ask people, what are the things that are most important to you in your life? It's generally the same across the world. So that's the first part. I'm sorry. And then the second part is for organizations, right? So us as people in organizations to create policies and practices that institutionalize more rigorous ways of problem solving and decision making. And that, particularly in the context of touching a lot of people's lives, that we're doing power analyses to understand how am I as an institution, how are my rules, policies, and practices creating inequities without us intending to do that? Well, who are the hidden players behind the scenes who are setting the agenda that maybe we are not even clear about how we're being influenced? And then kind of that last piece gets to what I was talking about earlier, which is what are the ideologies that are allowing this to happen within my organization?
Thank you so much for this.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Danny from Peking University of China. I have some questions for Mr. Saliba. I wonder, how does IRC work, or how does IRC cooperate with local government like New York or Boston, as you mentioned? Does it work more like do you work totally get involved in the whole process of the urban designing, or do you just work more like a think tank to give some advice? And who is going to pay for those facilities? Thank you.
Well, do you have any money? Yeah, I mean, yes. I would say humbly that the IRC is one of the better humanitarian organizations at working with local authorities, but we're still not as good as we should be. It's a new thing for humanitarian organizations to work hand in hand with municipal authorities. And the challenge with that comes from the traditional humanitarian service delivery model, which is direct delivery services. We are the ones who build the boreholes. We are the ones who hand out the vaccines. We are the ones who set up the health clinics. Versus in a city, all of these services already exist. And so how do we play the role of the consultant? Which is easy for me as a former consultant, but it's really trying to lend our technical expertise to ensure that the cities themselves are delivering services in a way that is inclusive of displaced and marginalized populations. It has been the joy of the past 3 years to try to get funding for this. I often say that donors are very willing to fund innovative research, but they're not yet willing to fund innovative action. I'm happy to say that the EPIIC, the EU humanitarian branch, well, they actually haven't awarded it yet, but I have high hopes that they are funding a response to resilience project in Maiduguri, the city that I've been talking about, where we work directly with affected communities to write resilience plans for these communities, and that it's actually displaced and host residents collectively putting their projects that they want to see happen in their communities in these plans. It would be a first of this kind of project, but stay tuned.
Thank you.
My name is Luca. I'm from the University of São Paulo in Brazil, and my question is directed to Mr. Saliba, but feel free to answer and comment as you wish. So the basis, in theory, the basis of a public policy is the planning. But when we are talking about migration crisis, especially refugee crisis, we usually have big flows of people entered and in the cities. And we have this new huge amount of people on the city that is looking for better conditions and has infrastructure needs and needs for public policies and for public services. And this is what not on the initial planning of the public administration. So my question is, how is this process of new planning to consider this new amount of people on by the view of the public administration and the policy making?
Well, I would say that it's better than you think. It's better than people expect. And it goes to what Justin was saying about, I guess what we're all saying about this idea of proximity to the people that at question, the population at question. And when you're closer to that reality, you tend to say, well, they're living in the city and I need to provide services for them. So even if you are in a red state or what have you, chances are it's definitely not uniform across the board, that's for sure. But you need to not assume whether or not they're going to fall on one side or the other. You need to actually figure out what side of the fence they fall on, and that's why you need to say hello first. But B, in my experience, generally it's positive. Generally, cities are more willing to adapt public policy in a way that's welcoming of immigrant and displaced populations than not.
Yeah, and I do think that most commonly you see elected officials seeing their job as serving everyone who lives in the city and wanting to, recognizing that the city is only as strong as its kind of most marginalized residents, and so wanting to incorporate everyone. But I've spent a lot of time studying cities also that have taken hostile responses, and I think that the question earlier about how people start to construct grievances and other themselves and create those boundaries is what sometimes leads to that. But I do think the more common perspective at the level of local government officials is that this is an opportunity, as Dr. Martin said earlier. It's going to take a lot of hard work, but this really is an opportunity.
Thank you. Hello, my name's Sebastian Loretti. I'm from New York. And I must say I'm a bit nervous because I think I'm about to ask one of the most divisive questions here today. So I'll preface my comments by saying this. My mother's from Brazil, my father's from Italy, and my existence in the United States relies on 2 generations, decades apart of immigration to this country. And the book I'm about to reference, How Democracies Will Die, which some of you may or may not have heard of, was written by 2 Harvard professors, and President Obama put it on his reading list for 2018. And the book basically does a very in-depth study on how democracies fail in the post-Cold War era, and they take a hard look at the United States. And they say a significant reason why the US government for the past 10 years, the performance of it has just been totally unacceptable. It's been, drowned in hyperpartisanship. Flint, Michigan still doesn't have clean water. Is frankly because of human nature and the fact that humans are irrational. And when you look at the 2 major political parties, the Republicans and Democrats, one party's one color, and the other party is a lot of colors. And before in US history, in the 70s, in the 80s, and in the 90s, it was much more, both parties, frankly, it was mostly white Christian. And human nature being what it is, when the person, your opponent, whether if you're a Republican, you're a Democrat, and vice versa, when your opponent looks like you, prays to the same God as you, and perception-wise, obviously, perception-wise, has the same values and more or less the same culture as you, it's a lot easier to look at the situation as us in this together and let's compromise to push the nation forward, as opposed to what it has become today, which is us versus them. Because frankly, the Democratic Party's a bunch of colors and the Republican Party's mostly full of just white people. And part of the reason that the 2 parties are going further and further apart from the center is that fact, that they're really becoming tools of almost ethnic politics, and Bill O'Reilly in 2008, I think when Obama won, went on Fox News, he said something akin to like white America has lost or something like that. It kind of illustrates the different perspectives and the political tension that is driving partisanship and the parties apart. And they also state in the book that to this day, there has not been one successful multicultural democracy anywhere in the world. They also say that the United States has the best chance of becoming that, and that it's going to try to become, but it's incredibly difficult to do. So my question is, considering the fact that a very, very, very substantial amount of Americans who, I would argue don't have the facts right, really don't understand migration, have clearly made their voice heard in 2016 and who they voted for, do you think maybe it's a political necessity, not from an economic standpoint, because from an economic standpoint, we all know migration is a great thing. And from a moral standpoint, I would argue, give me your tired, give me your poor, and that being part of America's mythos. But from a political standpoint, do you think it would be in America's long-term interest for the stability of its democracy and its government to look at the migration coming in the United States and say, okay, there's a substantial amount of Americans that are telling us too fast to slow down. So perhaps we should, yeah, so perhaps we should, you know, just slow down immigration into this nation, and until their concerns are addressed, until the Republican Party eventually becomes more mixed.
Sorry, I'm sorry, but in the interest of
that was my question. So yeah, so what's your comment on that?
Thank you for that.
And if not, why as well?
Thank you for that question, and I wish we had more time to discuss it because it's actually pretty interesting, gets to the heart of a lot of issues. I will say, just in terms of the underlying premise, I would not say that, I would not pit the Democratic Party against the Republican Party in terms of who's more angelic, because they both have leveraged the politics of other people's identities in order to gain power.
Yeah.
And so although the Democratic Party is more diverse, that is true in terms of who the membership happens to be, but those who are actually in leadership positions in the Republican Party, in the Democratic Party, are not as diverse as they could be. And so I say that to give context on the direction I'm taking with the answer. The underlying challenge that I see in our society is that we have had a pattern of anti-intellectualism and overall de-intellectualism within the country. So if you look at our education system, if you look at how we're teaching people, to use a shortcut language, the banking method, where we're just pouring knowledge into people's heads, and there's only a small group of us who actually go to schools, who actually learn what it means to be a leader and what it means to think critically. And so with that in mind, it is no surprise that we see, at least to me, that we see so many divisions and how easy it is to herd people into groups. It is actually our nature. In any way that we are able to identify ourselves as part of a group that is in it for the cause, tends to steer us in directions that where we don't always make good decisions. So I'll give a concrete example of it. I'll be quiet. So within the context of the United States and this issue of racism, we never talk about how racism hurts white people and how it's used as a tool to get white people to make decisions that are actually harmful to themselves. So I'll give the example of the opioid crisis. And at my organization and in my work, I call this boomerang daggering yourself. It is exactly how it sounds. We currently have an opioid crisis that we have painted with the face of white people, and therefore it is a public health issue. And we're fighting for resources in order to support people. In the 70s and 80s, when crack and heroin was introduced into communities of color by our government, not conspiracy theory, but documented history, we said it was a criminal issue and we should lock those people up because we couldn't see the simple fact that substance use disorder actually is no different in different communities. We're all suffering from it equally. We just use different drugs. And that if white people at that time had seen that the same thing that was harmful to communities of color, that even though theirs was on Front Street and in the news and theirs wasn't, theirs was happening behind closed doors, then we would have handled that issue as a public health issue back in the 70s and 80s. And we would have made some different decisions in that case. We would not have made as much investments in mass incarceration. We would have made those investments in the public health system. Fast forward to now, we don't have the public health infrastructure to take care of the issue in the current face that it's been painted with. So I use that as an example of this because the issue of politics in this country is very tied up in these fundamental ideas around how we paint the face of issues and get people to take positions. And so my answer is that folks need to take more responsibility, and we need to educate our children more, whether the schools are doing it or not, on what it means to critically analyze a situation and not take what people are giving you at face value, and to make good quality decisions for yourself based on reality, based on information that you have analyzed, and not based on fear, and not based on these emotions that lead us to decisions that ultimately hurt all of us. So the other thing is we need more parties. I mean, that's also part of the problem, but that's a discussion for another day.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Yeah, sorry, I'm going to have to cut the questions off there just because we're out of time. So I just wanted to thank our panelists and our audience. And our next panel, How South-to-South Migration is Changing Our World, will begin immediately. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I was looking at your logo in there. It actually reminds me of South by Southwest. Part of the issue.